For more debates, updates, and bonus clips, sign up at thebigconversation.show.
This is still very strange, right? Because if we believe that Jesus was God's son and God sent him to earth...
I most certainly do.
Right. So that happened about 2,000 years ago, right? And yet the world still has all of this suffering. So here's this supposedly all-powerful being who created the universe and everything, and who doesn't like the suffering that goes on, and who tried to do something about it 2,000 years ago, and yet the suffering is still going on. Doesn't seem to be really better. So it seems like he's a bungler. He made a bad mistake in thinking that sending his son to be crucified would somehow fix all the suffering in the world, and it plainly hasn't.
Well, actually, if I was going to be wonderfully sort of cheeky, I'd go, actually, Steven Pinker was sitting in that chair not long ago who says the world has got increasingly better in the last
well, but not as I agree with Steven Pinker about that, but not as much better as it ought to have got if we had an all-powerful
but I think
good being.
But here's the interesting thing. That answer, I think, that question, of course, is raised right from the very, very beginning, because the first Christians who went out across the Roman world and began preaching the Christian message and saw Christians go from being 0.0008% of the Roman Empire to 51.2% in 312 years, they knew full well that Christians were thrown to the lions, that earthquakes happened, that disease happened, yet they still believed that God had come in the person of Jesus, risen from the dead, that was the death blow struck to evil, and that was the beginning of God's new creation and putting the world back together again.
A strange false belief, I think.
Well, interesting you say false belief. One of the things that intrigues me about the suffering question as well, and to go, this is a rabbit trail of its own, but I think it's a fascinating one. One of the things that began to intrigue me as I taught, university level courses on the problem of evil was it's a peculiarly Western question. It's not that doesn't make it an irrelevant question, but when I would travel to the East, and I have many, many friends who are living in situations where they've experienced terrific suffering, persecution. I've met people who have lost their homes, their families, who've been tortured in prison for their Christian faith or experienced other things. These questions don't arise. It was pointed out after the tsunami, the Asian tsunami. It was Western newspapers that were running editorials with "Where is God?" That question wasn't being asked.
But because they don't really believe in that God that we believe.
Christians caught up in it would have been
Christians would have.
Muslims would have done. Those questions were not being asked, and that just tells me something. I think it tells me that whilst this is not an unimportant question, we forget that we all ask our question from a position. We approach our philosophy from a position, and we're approaching this as Westerners. And I think there is something when you draw that lens back, similarly historically, to go, if the problem of evil was such a spectacular argument against belief in a good God, then I think, as the Oxford professor C.S. Lewis famously asked, how did that belief ever arise in the first place? Men are crazy, but not as crazy as that.